Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about a very old case. So I am currently in the midst of writing about the history of child protection in the UK. And I want to really delve into the very first case that was widely publicised around a child death. But first, let's just talk about some other things, some more current things, shall we say. And I hope that the sound is okay. Please do let me know if it's not. Now, the first thing I need to tell you all is that last week we as a family, we lost our old dog, Chaos, who was 12, and old age got the better of her. So at the moment, I'm not feeling at my best. That's probably a good description. However, current things that are really worrying me. There are 2 children in Nova Scotia, Canada, called Jack and Lily Sullivan. And they are 6. So Lily is 6 and Jack is 4. And they're missing and have been since the 2nd of May. So if anybody who does subscribe to this channel can share this live and just bring some awareness to the fact that we need to understand where these children are. They went missing from their home on Gairloch Road in Nova Scotia. And the descriptions given by the parents were quite concerning. So at the very beginning, they both gave a very similar story with one big difference. So the story was that they were in their bedroom with their young child, who is 16 months old. So that's Mum, who is Malaya, and Daniel, who is stepdad to Jack and Lily, but dad to the young baby. And they could hear Jack and Lily in the next room. And they believed at that time that Jack and Lily had escaped through the sliding patio doors and wandered off into the woods. So it's a very, very, very rural area, like no neighbours kind of rural, kind of place I'd like to live. And they said that they just simply wandered off, and there was a huge man search. So there was ground rescue teams, drones, helicopters, water rescue teams, dogs were brought in, and they did that for 6 days, and they went out by 8 kilometres from the property and found nothing, apart from brought to their attention by a family member, one of Mum's family members, one boot print and a little piece of Lily's blanket. And the fact that all of those ground search teams were working, and the family were only allowed to go to places where the searchers had already been, and it was family that found it, that in itself is a red flag. And as soon as that happened, I'd be looking in the opposite direction if I was the RCMP. However, the story changed. So Malaya, who is Mum, has given no further statements. But what she did do was leave the following day. Now, if it was me, you wouldn't be able to get me out of that place if you threatened me with life in prison, because that's where my children had gone missing from. The fact that she left the next day suggests that she knows something that we don't. She took Meadow to her mum's house. She was supposed to be supervised 24/7 by mum, by grandma. And when one of her family members started to dig into the background and what had happened, she decided to leave her mother's house, so grandma's house, and went to her father's house on the reservation. So she's part Indigenous, and because of that, CPS came and took Meadow from her, because that was a breach of the order that was in place. The family member then came out with matching comments, let's describe it like that, from Daniel, because he's not come onto any platform live, but he has been posting comments with a story that Malaya was wanting to leave the relationship because of some bad blood between the two of them, and didn't think that she could leave without some help getting the children away. And I understand that to a certain degree. However, what she chose to do, if this is accurate, which I'm not convinced, but let's just say it is, and the chap who told us this is Darren Geddes, who is Malaya's grandmother's cousin. She wanted to get away, and so she got some member of her friend group, I think, to pull up at the road. She walked the children out, had Meadow on her hip. The children got in the car. She heard Janie, who is Daniel's mum, coming out of her RV and said, "You guys leave." And she just stood there and spoke to Janie and said, "Oh, I think the children have gone into the woods." And that's how this all started. Had she come out the next day and said, "I'm really sorry, but I was the victim of domestic abuse and I needed to get away and it was the only way I could think of, and I'm sorry for the false report," I suspect that that would have been believable, and she would easily have been able to demonstrate that the children are okay. And more importantly than that, she wouldn't be day by day racking up God knows how much in police resources that are being spent to try and find these children. Daniel has, as I say, in some ways acknowledged that what Darren has said is accurate, and I'm still not buying it 100%. It would be wonderful because it would mean that the children are alive, and of course that is wonderful. That would be the best case scenario, but unfortunately, given that we're now 2 months past when they went missing, I think the likelihood is that unfortunately something happened to these babies. And it really worries me. And so I want their names spread far and wide. And I want you to share this. And I'm just going to share their pictures. Bear with me. That's really unhelpful. I don't know what's happened to my screen. Give me 1 minute. I'm at 175% zoom. That's not really very Right, okay. Let me share my screen and move myself out of the way. I have got no idea how to move myself. Mm-hmm. There we go. There we go. Right, okay, so this is Jack and Lily. They are two absolutely adorable children. Please share this. Bring awareness to these missing babies, because unfortunately, the statistics don't bode well. But there is always a chance. And whatever the situation, they need bringing home one way or another. They have family members who are frantic. In particular, their paternal grandmother, Belinda Gray, is beside herself with absolute worry about what is going on with these children. She deserves answers, and they deserve to be brought home. So please share it, and then let's move on to the case that I'm going to talk about today. So, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about Dennis and Terry O'Neill. They are two brothers who were placed in a foster home in 1945. And what happened there set the scene for the start of the child protection system that we know today. So the main legislative framework is the Children Act of 1948. It still is. It stood the test of time. It's been tweaked along the way. We have other bits of legislation that fit in around it. But that was the start of the picture as we know it today. And this is the case that set that off. So this is where I'm going to start the journey. So in 1945, Reginald Goff was convicted of manslaughter of young 12-year-old Dennis O'Neill, who was his foster child of 7 months. He was sent to prison for 6 years at that point. Dennis's then 10-year-old brother, Terry, Terence, but everybody knew him as Terry, who was close to death himself at the time of Dennis's killing, gave evidence at his trial and inquest. And following a public outcry, Goff was resentenced and received 10 years for murder. Still not enough, but it was better than 6 years. Reginald's wife, Esther Goff, was convicted of neglect and exposing Dennis in a manner likely to cause unnecessary injury to health. That's an understatement. And sent to prison for 6 months. Those sentences, when you hear about the details, will seem ridiculously low and will probably infuriate you, because it absolutely infuriates me. But we are where we are. Things have moved on a little. Often still in the UK, sentences are rubbish. but we've certainly moved on from there. So let's go back to the start, though. So the O'Neills, that's where it all started. And we have to go back just after the turn of the century, quite some time ago. In the summer of 1918, John was 22 and Mabel, who was 21, were married in Newport in Monmouthshire. They were both in the military and they served in France. But in civilian life, John, who was dad, was a lightweight boxing champion of South Wales Borders, and Mabel was a nurse. And that all sounds quite normal. Both have things in their background that they've done. All good so far. However, didn't stay like that. So the couple had 11 children. One died at birth. So there were 2 adults and 10 children surviving on £2 a week in one squalid, uninhabitable room in Bolt Street. Now, £2 a week in that era was equivalent to about £145 in today's money, which is not enough to keep one person going, never mind 12. They were unemployed at the time, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. John would tell the children that he was going to work every day, which actually meant that he was off down the local pub to drink away whatever money they did in fact have. And that left obviously less money for the family to live on. I've got 2 children. I've got an entire house. And when they were young, it felt like a bit of a squash. It was hard to keep clean and tidy. There was too much child paraphernalia filling the space. I cannot imagine having 10 children in a normal kind of English house, let alone in one room. So it was no wonder that they had some trouble managing that situation. Nurse or no nurse, it was a bit of a struggle. That being said, in Terence's book, Someone to Love Us, which was published by HarperCollins, he describes moving about a lot because of his parents, who built up rent arrears, then needed to move, then they'd build up rent arrears and need to move, and that cycle went on. So he was born in Frederick Street, then they moved to Portland Street, followed by a flat in Commercial Road, and then his final move with his parents was to Bolt Street in Pill, which is Pulgwenil, which I've just murdered that. Even though I spent my early years in Wales, Welsh was pretty much terrified out of me by a tutor at my English school when we moved back to Manchester. So even though I've tried to learn since then, I can't. No matter what I do, I cannot learn Welsh. It is literally like it was my first spoken language. Can't do it. I cannot retrieve that information. And that just shows you what trauma can do to a person. But the book is amazing. Very, very moving read. I couldn't put it down. So if you're interested in finding out the whole story from the point of view of the child themselves, Terence's book is amazing. And what it gave to me was a really deep understanding of how a child feels when they face these types of traumas and adverse childhood experiences. Things like being neglected by the parents or ignored by them, being generally confused by adults. I'm often still generally confused by adults, but when they're taken into care, when they're separated from their siblings who they've, built a really good bond with, when they're moved between different placements within the care system, and most importantly, when they're subject to significant physical abuse, that trauma is immense. And it certainly gave me some really clear insight, despite having worked in this area for a very long time. It still gave me something to learn. But back to the original story. So in 1923, 5 years into the marriage, John served 1 month in prison for neglecting one of his children. There was then a big gap with no involvement. I'm sure they were on professionals' radar, to be fair, but there wasn't any kind of documented involvement at that time. But John remained permanently unemployed between 1919 and 1930, which was the period of peace. So we're talking about between the two world wars. That was the period of peace. He was unemployed all the way through. The children were pretty much left to their own devices. So in the book, Terry describes sitting on the banks of the river, watching the swinging bridge and watching the boats go by, whilst Dennis was at school during the day, much to the chagrin of the dock workers, who clearly knew how dangerous it was for a child that young, preschool age, to be sat dangling off a swinging bridge while it's moving. But there was one man in the back corner of the dockyard who worked in one of the huts, and he would give him biscuits. Now, when food is scarce, biscuits are very, very tempting. Terry recalls often feeling starving, but that they were in fact fed. Watery stew, mash, or fried bread most days. Mabel often went without food for the day so that the children could eat. So, yes, they were very poor. Yes, their parents were quite neglectful, but at least, this woman, well, the pair of them, they didn't beat the children, and they tried to feed them. Terry was bullied by other boys in the area. Dennis, as his older brother, would protect him once he got out of school for the day. The two were really close, so they were only 2 years apart, and I think that made them have a very strong bond. They would play together, do all the things that children with time and no money or attention do. So play hopscotch, climb trees, generally go on adventures. They had a younger brother, Freddie, who was 2 years younger than Terry, but we're talking about Terry as a preschooler here. So at that time, Freddie would have been a toddler. So he didn't play out with them. Tom, one of the older boys, so he was about 10 at this stage, got sent off to reform school because he was always skipping school and getting into trouble, but did try and look out for the younger children as best as he could, even back then. And then just before Christmas in 1939, the couple then faced neglect charges again, this time in respect of the 4 youngest children. And that was before Newport Magistrates Court and the NSPCC inspector, so that's the National Society for the Protection of Children, which is still one of the biggest child protection charities in the UK. They hold all of the archives of serious case reviews for files. They are the main charity that people would tell you about if you ask them what's the UK child protection charity. The inspector from the NSPCC described the living conditions as indescribable, with filthy floors. The children were covered in sores and bug bites. They were underweight. Terry always had a cold, and he was covered in an itchy rash all over his chest. And by all accounts, the children were severely neglected. And at that point in time, the children in the home were Cyril, who was 18, Betty, who was 16, Charles, who was 12, Tom, who was 10, Rose, who was 8, Dennis was 6, Terry was 4, and Freddie was 2. So, children ranging from 2 to 18 in the home. The inspector called out a doctor to look at the children because he was really concerned about them. And that doctor said that the 4 youngest children needed hospital treatment. So the parents were sent to jail for a month. During that time, the 4 youngest children were sent to Newport Poor Law Hospital, which was called St. Woolos. Now, even though it was a poor law hospital, so it's not likely to have been like staying at the Ritz, let's face it. The children at that point couldn't believe their luck because the nurses were tending to their every need. They were being fed, watered, medicated, kept clean, and given affection and care. The care and affection that every child needs. So we often talk in neglect about like neglecting the child's basic needs for food, water, hygiene. But one of the most important things for any child is time and attention. Without that, they will not develop. And I saw this thing the other day, which is slightly off track, but bear with me, where there was this woman who just didn't speak to a baby. And she was just gobsmacked why anybody would speak to a baby. She couldn't understand it. And the person who was speaking to her was kind of saying, so you don't speak to the baby at all? And the woman's like, no. Like, ever? You mean you don't use baby talk? No, I just don't speak to her. Why would I speak to her? She can't answer me back. I cannot put too much emphasis on this. Babies, even tiny ones, need time and attention, and they need to be spoken to because that's how they learn the language of humans. Otherwise, they're not going to develop. They're going to be seriously behind their peers. They certainly won't be school ready at the right age. You need to just talk to them like they're any person who you're close to. Because even though they can't answer back, they will pick up what you're telling them. So describe what you're doing. Describe, the colour of the walls and the colour of the food and what the food is called and all of those things, because the child is going to pick it up. However, let's go back to this. So children were in St. Woolos. The children during that time got their very first proper Christmas with a Christmas meal, presents, games, fun, all of those things that every child should experience right from the very first December that they're on this planet. And they were gobsmacked. They just didn't really comprehend why and what was going on, but they liked it. Once they were well enough, though, obviously they had to go somewhere and they weren't going to be sent home, let's face it. Not when they'd been in that state. Sorry, I need to reposition myself. My back is so sore. I'm sitting with my back against a shiatsu cushion. Oh, to be young and healthy again. However, so what were the next steps? Rose, who was the eldest of those young four, was taken to her maternal grandmother's house in Newport. Dennis and Terry were taken to Stow Hill Children's Home. That was in January of 1940, and Freddie joined them later. So he wasn't quite well enough to leave at the same time, but he followed on. Then in May 1940, there was a court hearing. We know that there's going to be child protection hearing of some kind, even back in those days. And it was decided that the boys would remain in local authority care. So in October of that year, so we're still in 1940, they go to their very first foster home, which is Mr. and Mrs. Sorrell, or Sorrell. And that was just outside Hereford, sorry. And they lived in a pretty old cottage. So think quaint English cottage in the countryside. It had its own grounds. It was on the edge of a small village. And it was nice. Children liked it. The family were strict but fair. I apologise for that barking. That's Pansy, my special pooch, being noisy because somebody was at the door. She's very good as a little guard dog, even though she's only the size of a peanut. So this couple, they were strict but fair, sometimes affectionate. I think that was quite common in those days, that, you know, children were seen and not heard, that type of thing, but they weren't cruel. There was a garden to play in, and across the field there was an aerodrome, so they got to watch the planes taking off and landing. Let me just bear with me 1 minute, because I'm going to beg one of my young slaves, i.e. my son, if I can have a cup of coffee, please. And you can't say no because we're on live stream. You're going to be sloping around the house when you're 17 years of age. You've got to pay your way in cups of coffee. So they got to watch planes taking off and landing, which would be very exciting for young children, especially young boys. And they were there until the new year of 1941, so only a few months, but long enough that they'd settled quite well. They were reasonably happy. And a welfare officer arrived one morning and said, right, okay, you're moving. There was no getting them ready for the idea. So today we would sit down, we would do life story work with children, we'd do direct work with them about what's going to happen, all of those things. Try and make it as easy on them as we can, but no, not back then. It was just someone turned up at the door and said, right, pack your bags, we're going. And then next they went to Mr. and Mrs. Connop's house. Now, they lived in a big black and white house, and it was set in a huge gardens with an adjoining farm that was run by Mr. Connop and his son, and that was in Yarpole near Leominster. The first thing that shocked the boys was that there was a maid who described Mrs. Connop as the lady of the house. Now, that would shock even me, to be fair. I'd quite like to be called the lady of the house. Instead, I'm just called the boss, generally, by people. Although I think Pansy's the boss, really. Terry was amazed and said they really landed on their feet this time. And Dennis just shrugged his shoulders and said one of his frequent and very well-known sayings, which was, if things don't change, they'll stay as they are. For a child of what would have been, I don't know, 10 at that point, maybe 11, to have that attitude to life is just heartbreaking. And I mean literally heartbreaking. To know that much uncertainty at that age is really upsetting. Mr. and Mrs. Connop had a son called James who lived there, 2 older sons and a daughter who were all in the forces, so they weren't living there at the time. And they also had a lodger who lived in a room off the main hall. The maid would be their main carer, really. And they dubbed her Ginger because she had a mane of bright red hair. And so, of course, you can imagine it would come up with Ginger as a nickname. Mr. Connop was a prankster. Just bear with me because I really need to take this call